There is also a second problem with the approach of the Mizrahi, in that even if we were to accept that there is a similarity between Rashi's approach to the Iver and the Cheresh, it does not explain the changes that Rashi makes to the follow-on phrase of Velifnei Iver, namely, Lo Titein Michshol. The translation of Michshol is a stumbling block. Rashi changes the definition of a Michshol, interpreting the Michshol to mean the presentation of verbal advice, and in particular inappropriate verbal advice that one gives. In the same vein, the word titein with a nun taf nun shoresh involves the physical act of giving or putting, so that not only does Rashi alter the definition of an iver, he also changes the nature of the prohibition of lo titein michshol from physically placing the stumbling block to al tomer, to the act of not communicating information, such as mechor sadacha. Why don't you sell your field, real estate, v'kach lecha chamor, and with the proceeds, purchase an animal. It is for these two reasons that the Rebbe rejects the reading of the Mizrahi into Rashi that justify the various changes with respect to the Iver based upon a similarity to the changes that Rashi makes to the Cheresh of this very same pasuk. There is a further problem with the commentary of Rashi, but before launching into that anomaly, some clarification is needed to the distinction that had been made previously regarding the two approaches in the interpretation of a written law, the two schools of thought with respect to the Constitution of the United States, namely the letter of the law, literalism, versus the amplification of the law so that it can be used to address changes in circumstances that inevitably must arise with the passage of time. While in very broad terms we can apply these two approaches when interpreting Torah law so that the letter of the law would be reflected in the Pshuta Shel Mikra reading of a text, whereas the spirit of the law would be reflected in three other paths for Torah interpretation, that of Remez, Drush, and Sod. According to this model, when Rashi writes and defines the Iver as an individual who is Summa Badavar, blind to certain situations, we argued that this commentary in effect amends, changes the Iver of the Pasuk, and in doing so rejects the Pshuta Shel Mikra interpretation of the Pasuk. This approach would be at odds with that of the Rambam. In a short footnote, we are directed to an observation that the Rambam makes in his sefer HaMITZVOT, Mitzvot Lo Ta'aseh Reish Tzadik Tet, where he defines the commandment of Velifnei Iver Lo Titein Michshol. There he writes, V'lav ze kolel gamkein. This negative commandment also includes Mi sheyazor al aveira chulhu, one who assists, who facilitates the violation of Torah law by, for example, providing a Jew with non-kosher food. The Iver component would be that the recipient of this food would be unaware that the food is not kosher, or alternatively, knows that the food is not kosher but has no access to that food. The Rambam goes on to write, Upshita Dekra, the Pshuta Shel Mikra understanding of the Pasuk is Kamo Shezacharnu Tchila, is as had been noted at the beginning of my commentary, namely, Im Yish'alcha Adam Eitza, if one asks for some advice, Vayikra 19:14 demands that Al Titein Lo Eitza, one should not give advice, She'ena Hogenet, which is not appropriate for that individual and would cause the individual a financial loss. Clearly, the Rambam, while allowing for a midrashic interpretation to the Velifnei Iver, also allows for, or in fact maintains, that the Pshuta Shel Mikra understanding is the default explanation of this commandment. This in contrast to Rashi, who appears to maintain that the default interpretation of Velifnei Iver is one that amends, that changes, and in doing so rejects the Pshuta Shel Mikra. Both agree, however, that one can read into the Iver of Vayikra 19:14 that it refers to one who is Summa B'davar, unaware of a set of circumstances that might be detrimental to the individual. Which brings us to the question as to the example that Rashi uses for the Summa B'davar, namely, providing advice to one who is ignorant of the consequences of taking that advice resulting in a financial loss. In Western common law, an accomplice is a person who actively participates in the commission of a crime, even if they take no part in the actual criminal offense. Examples would include the driver who provides transportation to those individuals who have allegedly performed a criminal act, or providing the alleged criminal with tools and weapons with which to carry out the criminal offense. Within the framework of the halachic system, an accomplice would be one who is Ya'azor al-Aveira, one who assists an individual to violate a Torah law. Facilitating the violation of a Torah law is first raised over 1,000 years earlier in the Talmud Bavli Masechet Pesachim 22b, where the Gemara introduces a Braita in the name of Rabbi Natan, who asks rhetorically, Minayin, what basis is there within the Torah text that shelo yoshit adam kos yayin lenazir? A nazir is prohibited from the consumption of wine and wine products. The question raised by the Gemara is whether or not there is a prohibition against obtaining wine for a nazir, much like the issue of an adult providing alcohol for underage drinking. Similarly, would the provider be in violation of Torah law, and if yes, what basis within the text is there for that violation? A similar issue is raised with respect to providing a B'nai Noach, a non-Jew, who, as part of the Sheva Mitzvot de B'nai Noach, is prohibited from consuming meat that is deemed to be Eiver min hachai, meat that came from an animal that had not died. The question raised by the Gemara is whether or not a Jew may provide such meat to a non-Jew. Rabbi Natan maintains that in both instances there would be a violation of Torah law and bases that restriction on the commandment of V'lifnei iver lo tetein michshol. In this case, blind refers to one who does not have access to the prohibited item. This is yet another example, one quoted by the RAMBAM, for the midrashic interpretation of the prohibition of lifnei iver. Clearly, both Rashi and the RAMBAM allow for a midrashic interpretation to the lo titein michshol. Why is it then that Rashi provides an example in which the titein component is reinterpreted as a verbal communication in the form of advice? A far better option for Rashi would have been to use the example brought by the RAMBAM, that of facilitate and creating access for the violation of Torah law. The advantage of this example would be that it would be more aligned with the actual wording of the text, which is lo titein michshol, an act of providing the michshol, as opposed to Rashi, who has elected to reinterpret the titein not as giving or providing, but one involving speech.